Welcome to the Education of a Financial Planner, where we look at the major concepts in financial planning through the lens of two quant investors who are learning the ropes of the planning process and how to help clients achieve their long-term goals. Learn along with us as experienced financial planner Matt Ziegler helps us understand the most important financial planning concepts that impact all of us and how we can apply them to achieve the best outcomes in our financial lives. In each episode, we will work through one major financial planning concept from the ground up and learn how we can apply it in the real world. From retirement to college savings to taxes to estate planning, we will cover a wide range of topics that apply to each of our everyday lives. We hope you will join us in our learning journey.
Justin Carbonneau and Jack Forehand are principals at Validea Capital Management. Matt Ziegler is managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Validea Capital or Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Validea Capital or Sunpoint Investments.
So did you guys miss me?
Actually, we had the best, most popular, most widely viewed podcast ever without you, Jack.
Well, it's funny because I was looking back. And so like, if you look at the metrics on our episodes, like two of the best ones we've ever done is one, when we did the estate planning thing with Ben. That is some of the best metrics we've ever done. And then last week when I'm not here, it has some of the best metrics we've ever done. So I'm thinking like you and Matt are putting two and two together here. And you're like, wait a second, add Ben, subtract Jack, things get better. So I'm a little nervous for my job. I mean, I have to perform well this week, I think, or you might not see me next week.
It's a stated fact that correlation does equal causality, right?
Well, and speaking of, Ben's back to join us today because the focus of this discussion is how someone that's a little bit younger than Jack, you, me, and Matt, how he goes about thinking of his own financial planning and managing his life, his family, his career, thinking about retirement. One of the things, I don't know what you guys think of this, but like a lot of times when I talk to investors that haven't prepared necessarily well for their retirement, a lot of times it was like, no one ever educated me on this. No one ever talked to me about this. And, I think that's somewhat of a legitimate thing. It's interesting. In the state of Connecticut, actually, they're introducing some legislation that by 2027, all high schools need to implement a financial planning sort of course in high school, which I think is good, because then people won't be able to necessarily use that excuse. Although it's still tough, and that's where I wanted to start. Sort of, Ben, I guess a little bit with you is, you're in the business, you do this for a profession, you talk to a lot of young investors, people that are starting their career, but how do you explain to them the importance of, time and starting early and thinking about this stuff? Like, how do you engage them and get them to really like embrace this and start thinking about it seriously?
It's not an easy conversation. And I most times, especially if I think about my circle of friends, as I started my career at Vanguard, and just as soon as somebody hears that you work in this profession, the questions start to just kind of flow in on a weekly or monthly basis, whatever it is. And it's questions on a variety of topics. But the approach is always to try to learn about their specific situation. The way that I try to then like bridge the gap to education, almost all questions are rooted around one main concern, whatever that is in their life. A lot of it has to do with saving, financial security, and financial freedom, whether that financial freedom is retirement or whatever the situation is. We'll get to talking about kids a little bit later in the podcast, but I think the importance is relating it always back to their situation. So you can talk about compounding all you want, how the being on the right side of compounding and not the wrong side, which is, high interest debt. Most people can conceptualize the math behind it, how it relates to them, and maybe their cash flow and their balance sheet. That's when the rubber starts to meet the road and you can see the practicality. And that's when people start to like pick up some of those lessons. So that's a bit of my approach. Each situation is just a little bit unique. Nobody's the same. So that's how I try to start the conversations.
I would think one of the most challenging things when you're young is like, first of all, you're probably not thinking about this stuff. But second of all, there's actually probably a lot of things you should be thinking about. Like there's a million different priorities you could be thinking about in your life. And a lot of them are not financial. So I'm wondering just like, as a young planner and as someone who's, young, setting up your own life, I mean, how do you think about prioritizing all the different things that are out there that you could be thinking about?
Jack, my wife hates this. This is like, because it's my life, it consumes me. I just know I've been through some things in my life that highlight the importance of having a plan. And one of the specific things I shared with a client last week is, like, I lost my dad when I was 19. There was no plan, very little life insurance. He was the breadwinner. Like, my mom had to just figure it out with 4 kids. For me, it's like, how do I prevent that situation with more the masses? How do we just set up? And that's why, we talked about estate planning. Sure, sometimes we're talking about folks in the ultra high net worth or the high net worth space, but really that's why we talked about estate planning is for everybody. So when you're thinking through some of these topic areas of how to, we need to cover each one of these: risk management, insurance, and estate planning. We need to think about how we're, again, compounding and saving the right rates. How are we working through, some of the other factors in our life or decision making around buying a house or buying a car? All of those things factor into the financial plan. And I know that Matt's talked about this at length around the CCBS. That has really helped me simplify things to even my wife when I talk about this around, like, hey, what are the next 1 to 3 to 5 years look like? That resonates much more with her than, like, how do we save the right amount of money for retirement? Because that is so abstract because it's 40 years away or 30 years away. So that's how, like, things get a little bit diluted in those conversations. How I think about it in my life, I know all the topic areas that we need to cover. My wife hates talking about it all the time, but when there's something outstanding in our life, she feels it in the house, I think. So that's how I approach it.
Yeah, I think sometimes, it's weird. Like the people that end up getting financial plans, I mean, everybody should have a financial plan to a degree, but the people that end up getting them sometimes are the people who, at least on a ranking scale, would need them the least. Like, so for instance, I know people in my life who make millions of dollars and don't have a financial plan. And, they can pretty much get through it because they make millions of dollars. Like, they can figure it out. Like, but a lot of times people who really need the money, really need these types of things in their lives to make sure, because a mistake can really cost them. If you're making millions of dollars, you can overcome a lot of stuff. If you're not, you can't. And so I think, going back to your point, I think a lot of people, like, that need these things, don't realize that they need these things.
I think that's absolutely correct. Actually, Matt and we've had this conversation a couple times for, those individuals, to your point, Jack, that need it the most often can't access it. You think it's very similar in, like, the tax world, the tax planning world. Many of those individuals that need the most tax help either can't afford it or they can't find the right person to help them. And there's a variety of folks, and Matt and I have a very similar approach here, where if you're going to reach out to us and ask us the question, and maybe we could provide you the right education around that without you having to compensate us. Now, look, we can't obviously work for free all the time and be doing this full time, but I think it's finding the right trusted help in your life. The other avenue that you have is the CFP has a list of advisors that are willing to help on a somewhat pro bono basis for those that are lower income situations. And that's the reason that they've partnered with some other organizations to provide this. I've signed up on the list. I know it sounds great. I haven't had to do it yet, or nobody's reached out to me yet to do it, but there are resources out there to provide you with support in making some of these decisions in your life, or just helping you think, like, big picture about all these complexities that, the 4 of us talk about all the time with clients.
On the flip side of that too, like, for people who have, large sums of money, or have, like, exited a business and they're 25 years old or 30 years old or whatever else, like, the flip side of this is, just because you don't have a plan, or you don't, quote unquote, need a plan because you got the money to solve the problems. I just had a conversation with somebody else about this, where it's like, okay, you got somebody cleaning the house and cleaning the pool and taking care of your garden and your garage and all your cars and whatever other, like, things, the things you've had that are supposed to, like, make life better or improve your quality of life. But it's like, you pay somebody to do all this stuff, and then you're just, doom scrolling Twitter and LinkedIn or something. And so the human side of it too is, like, part of the planning is, like, connecting the cash flow, connecting the calendar, connecting the balance sheet to purpose. And so if you want to pay somebody else to come in and do all this stuff and make your life easier or better, don't turn around and do a bunch of things that make your life worse, which see that all the time too.
And also my point wasn't like those people don't necessarily need it. Like, if you go talk to lottery winners about the millions they won, they're going to tell you that it did not go very well after that. 10 years later, things did not work out the way they hoped. So everybody probably needs it. It's just sometimes people who are, closer or just barely getting by, like think they don't need that type of thing. But you do. I mean, that's what allows you to plan for contingencies. It's what allows you to deal with some sort of problem you didn't expect, if it comes up.
The rate of change in that is another point that's really worth mentioning. Like if you go through a big rate of change thing, lottery being the extreme example, or like a series of successive pay raises, just talked to somebody this week, younger person, so like 30s, early 30s, and in the last 5 years has gone from somebody who didn't grow up with any money and now all of a sudden is making, healthy 6-figure income. And there's just a bunch of basic stuff that he and his family have never been through for tax planning and other things. And so it's just this clear and obvious thing of when the rate of change is very fast and a bunch of stuff happens, you might need to turn around and get some help to see through it, because when life changes really quick, how are you supposed to know?
So let's work through some of these priorities. And Ben, maybe you can give me some, how you think about them personally, but also how you think about them for clients. And the first one is planning for a family to have kids. And, my approach was effectively wife gets pregnant, panic. And I don't know if that's one you endorse as a financial planner, but maybe you might have something better for me than that.
You know what? I wish I could tell you I did something different. I wasn't a CFP at the time when Avery was born. So this is 4+ years ago. But I was in the wife gets pregnant. What do we do now? And somebody told me like, hey, you should think about an estate plan. Mary Kate has an aunt and uncle that are really big attorneys in our area. So like that was kind of handed to us. But the life insurance side of things is where, when I was in the CFP program, is really what caught my eye. And the story I shared before about my dad, that is the first spot that I start the conversation with clients or anybody that brings up to me that they're planning to have a kid or maybe their wife's pregnant right now. It's like disability insurance and life insurance. How do we plan for the two most tragic events that could happen, and what does that do to the people that are still alive, that are dependent on you? I know that's not where anybody wants, like, we're about to bring a life into this world. Let's talk about ending a life. Like, that's not how anybody wants to think about this. But you think about the low risk, high severity. That's where I start the conversation. Again, it's not always like the most fun thing to talk about, but it is something that we need to plan for. As soon as you bring another life into this world too, we need to have a plan, and that's hence the estate plan, trust planning set up. What happens if something happens to both of us? Like, who's going to take over helping out and caring for this child? Let's make sure that we have the conversation, because it's not us just selecting a person. It's us having a conversation with maybe the child's aunt or uncle. Maybe it's my parents or her parents, whatever it is. Like, that's where we start this conversation about like, hey, we're going to have a child. Let's make sure that we have our ducks in a row from a risk and insurance perspective. The next element of that is what I always recommend today. You're going to have a child, let's say in 6 months. Let's start living the cash flow life like the child's here today. Let's build out like, hey, what did diapers cost? I mean, you guys know, it's not cheap. You're buying them every single week, right? It's like Target pickup every single week for diapers and wipes. It's nonstop. Formula you add to that. There's childcare that you have to pay for. Like, let's map that out today and prepare before the child gets here. Let's also make sure that there's ample savings for the healthcare costs that are going to go along with the first 12, 18, 24 months. If we start to live that life today, there's less shock when this all actually happens. And now you're working off less sleep, higher stress, and you're trying to balance the financials of all this. Like, we can do some preparation ahead of time to help you.
Those are all really good points. One thing I miss personally is life insurance in both directions. So like, I work and my wife doesn't, but you don't really think about, well, guess what? If my wife was not here, somebody's taking care of the kids. Like, a lot of people think if someone doesn't have an income, they don't need life insurance. And that's not really true. And that's something I screwed up myself, like in my own life.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally valid. The same thing is because you think about disability insurance is to replace an income, but you would still need something in force if your wife became disabled. And that's where as a planner, you think about what Matt was saying before, there's unknown unknowns. There's things that you don't know that you don't know. So it's hard to plan for them. And that's where working with a professional, sure, we're going to take care of like the immediate needs that may be causing you stress. But just know that there's things that are like processing in our brain of like, all right, these are areas that we're going to need to tackle in a future conversation. We're just biding our time to make sure that we bring that stuff up.
So does the fact that I'm sitting here at 90 degrees outside and my AC unit failed 2 hours ago, does that count as does that count as unknown unknowns?
That is an unknown unknown. Yes, Jack.
How about education planning? You know, that's an interesting one. You know, in an ideal world, obviously, you find out you're pregnant, you start, you know, whatever you start the accounts like as soon as they're born, you get going, like, but that's not the way it works in the real world a lot of the time. So how do you think about like when you have kids and education so far in the future, how do you think about like starting that education planning process?
Knowing what college is going to cost in 18 years is just such an impossible. Like you think about where we are today. There's so much talk about free college. We just sat on the brink of a tuition reimbursement or, you know, tuition cancellation of debt. Like there are so many things that are going to happen over the next 18 years. I will say one of the benefits of the Secure Act 2.0 changes was, you know, if you overfund that 529, I know I'm going backwards here, but if you overfund that 529, there is ways to roll some of that money into a Roth where in a prior life, if you put too much money in a 529, you're either giving really nice gifts to your nieces and nephews via 529 contributions, or you're paying taxes and penalty to get it out. The way that I think about this is just the same as, you know, any goal planning. The earlier you get started, the better. And you can actually start funding college before the kid's born, even before your wife's pregnant. Like you could start a 529 today and have it set up under your own name and have it change the name when the child is born. So the earlier you get started, the less that you need to commit maybe on a monthly or a quarterly basis to these accounts. The number one question that I get asked, how much is it going to cost? Like, how much do I need to save? If I want to pay for all of my son's college, how much? And I usually go over to Charles Schwab offers a tool that uses historical inflation rates on university costs. And that's what I use. I use a proxy. I'm here in Pennsylvania, so I use Penn State. And that's how my wife and I do it. We forecast out. I wish I could just like front pay it today for 14 years from now for Avery, but it's not possible. But you can get a proxy in place, say like, all right, we're going to need about $140,000, which is a large amount of money. But you break that down on a monthly basis. All right, what if we're putting in $250, $300 a month over 18 years, and we supplement that with a brokerage account? Maybe we get to school when Avery gets a full ride. Like that's what we're praying for at this point. But then we need to, all right, we have $100,000 in this 529, then what? But that's how I start the conversation of like, let's figure out what the cost is, how much you want to contribute, because not everybody wants to pay 100%. I don't either. All right, you want to pay 75%, have your kid have some skin in the game too. That's how we start this conversation. But again, we're trying to plan for the unknown. And there's just a little bit of like guesstimation work that has to go in to the ultimate plan around education.
It's an interesting time to be doing it because I'm obviously planning. I'm saving for college and planning as if college is going to be the same. But I have a 4-year-old, and there may not be college when my 4-year-old gets to that age. I mean, Google may be educating our kid. I mean, we don't really know. I mean, this is such a period of technological change. And to your point before, the government will likely give you ways out, Roth IRAs or something like that. If it really gets to the point where college costs way, way less, or it's some sort of technology-driven thing, there'll be ways probably to get that money down.
There are some states that do allow you to prepay. So you can actually do like prepayment plans for college. Most people don't do it, but there are some states that I think do allow that.
There are guaranteed savings programs in a number of states now where they'll index against your state's schools. So you just have to understand the terms that they're calculating that by, either in prepayment or the guaranteed savings programs. Usually, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, because I think Pennsylvania has one, indexed back to the inflation rate for the state schools.
That's correct. I want to pay for Penn State's cost today, though. I want to freeze. Right. I don't know if they're going to love me. That's my. I don't think they're going to help you there.
How do you think, picking up like on the broad topic of insurance, how do you think young people should think about insurance? Like I know one of the things I learned a lot on the CFP exam, and actually a little bit before that, I'd figured this out, is like the importance of an umbrella policy. Like, having something that's very, very cheap, that doesn't cost very much, that sits on top of all your other insurances in case something really, really goes wrong. But like, what are some other bullet points in terms of really important things for young people to think about on the insurance side?
So life insurance is, I'll start there because that's one of the most popular, but I'll move to disability, which is like the most missed. So life insurance, most people have a policy through work, a group policy. And what I often hear when having the conversation around life insurance is, but I have a policy through work. And okay, great, send it to me. And it's for $150,000. What is your wife going to do with your child for $150,000? Not a lot. It's just not enough money. Helping them understand what life costs and putting that over 15, 20 years, that's where the real calculation comes in. And then that's when you see the light bulb come on of like, oh, wow, I probably need like 10x this. And for most young, healthy individuals, term life insurance is incredibly cheap. Maybe it's going to cost you $35 or $40 a month, but to provide total coverage for you. So life insurance is one of those things that's often confused. The other miss with a group policy is if you leave your company, the group policy is gone. You might be able to keep it going for maybe 1 to 2 years, depending on the terms, but that's 1 to 2 years that you keep that policy alive. And then you may go to another company where they might not have a great benefit to offer you there, or they may not have a group policy at all. So then you need to buy a private policy in your mid to late 30s. The inflation on those climbs incredibly fast once you cross the 35 mark as a male. Usually it's like late 30s for a female because females live longer than men do. So those are some things that I like to bring up and what the premium adjustments are on those as you get older. If we move into disability is an area where the probability of it happening now in the United States is 1 in 4 Americans will be disabled between their start of their working career at 24 and 65. Your odds of using your life insurance are much, much lower than that. A few percentage points odds. It's incredibly low. So you would think, hey, we should make sure that the disability policy is bolstered up, but it's actually the opposite. I have come across a very few, conversations around risk management and insurance where I look at a disability policy or we're going through the financial planning summary and I'm like, oh, wow, this is great. We have great coverage here for disability for somebody that's young. Likely, it's through a group policy at work. Again, you leave, something happens to you, you get sick after you leave your company and you don't have coverage. It could be a tough road. So disability and life insurance are two of the ones that I try to talk to the most just because the risks are the highest. But since I've been here at Sunpoint the past 6 months, property casualty, I have most people, like part of their onboarding is they send us their property casualty because if most people don't, I'll ask you guys, Justin and Jack, Matt, you guys answer. When's the last time that you guys have reached out to your insurance agent to like run a comparison on your auto or home policy?
I actually just did recently because I noticed a pretty big increase. That's one thing that's happening around the country is because property values are up. So I went through, I use AAA and they're pretty, they're pretty responsive to customer inquiries and stuff. And they have like local agents like on the ground that will work. So I'm in Connecticut. And I forget my dwelling costs. I wanted to know like the methodology behind, because what they had on the policy seemed like much higher than what I think my house is worth. Well, what these insurance companies do is there's different methodologies where if you wanted your house to be rebuilt exactly like it is now, like I have some plaster, I have different things in my house, those cost estimates are like as is, like the house is being rebuilt like exactly as it is. Where I said, you know what? If you need to rebuild my house, you can use sheetrock. I don't care what my walls are really made of. And so I was able to kind of chip it down a little bit, but it wasn't as much as I hoped in terms of the premium, but I did look at it. So maybe I'm kind of going a little bit off your example, because I know where you're going is a lot of people don't look at this stuff.
Right. And ultimately, inflation takes effect. Also, you stick with the same insurance carrier. I'm not here to slander insurance companies, but your costs go up. If you don't pay attention, those are things that can get out of control. We think back to the cash flow. How do we help you manage down on expenses? And that's one of them. And yeah, a lot of them will use rebuilding costs. And just in the last 2 to 3 years, rebuilding costs have skyrocketed with inflation for a lot of materials.
And I got to say, especially with younger families, it's looking at the policy for the house, looking at the umbrella policy, knowing what happens when your kids insist they want that trampoline and you put it in your house, knowing what happens when you decide to get that above ground pop-up inflator tube pool from Walmart one summer, and then it collapses and floods your basement, or when you have worked through a total loss a few years ago with clients on a house, but it was luckily the insurance was there. Like, you have to know, how much do you owe on the mortgage? How much is the equity? How much is the rebuild? And even though that's an extreme low probability event, what are you going to do when something goes wrong? And just what the order of operations are. Because that's, 99% of this, Ben, I think you'd agree with this, is just like order of operations. So you thought through it once so that when something goes wrong, you have a process for thinking through, how are we going to solve this and figure out all the things that are impacted.
This next one, I would guess, and you guys can tell me because you see this more than I do, like I would guess nobody plans for this, which is aging parents. I would assume nobody has any plan whatsoever. And obviously some parents have handled this on their own. You don't have to worry about it, but there's some cases where they haven't. So like, what do you guys see around this idea of aging parents, and what do you think people are doing, and what should people be doing?
Nobody plans for this until they've been through it. This is like the golden rule of long-term care and aging parents is, as soon as you deal with it firsthand, then you become an evangelist for wanting to deal with this stuff. And I'm the oldest in my family. I grew up with all 4 grandparents, and I've seen firsthand, like we just moved my dad's dad into a home a few weeks ago and out of the house where he's been living. He's in his early 90s. I've got my other grandparents in and out of rehab. I wrote a post about some of the craziness of like, we lost grandpa one day and just the circus that ensues. The cost of aging parents is one of those things. You just have to know if you're part of the sandwich. My parents are going through it crazy right now, and they're terrified of putting me through it, which is why I had them hire a good financial planner like Ben to come in and do the work.
Spot on.
So the last one is, before I hand it back to Justin, is this emergency fund thing. And I think this is probably something else people fall down on a lot because they're thinking about all these other priorities we listed. And like, by the time they're done with that, there's nothing left. So how do you talk to people about establishing an emergency fund and thinking about how much they should be putting in there?
There's a couple good rules that I think are easy to stick to. The safest scenario is to take, we go through your cash flow, your calendar, your cash flow, and your balance sheet. That expense number for the monthly expense multiplied by 6, so you have 6 full months of expenses, sit it in a money market fund. There's never been a better time in most of our lives to be in a money market fund than it is today. So I'll say that. Now, if people want to be a little bit, more risk on, they can move that down. There is a spectrum of 3 to 6 months. That's typically the safety net. And that range all depends on, how risky you want to be. So 3 to 6 months is typically what I would recommend. The purpose of it sitting in cash is you want maximum liquidity. If you lost your job today and your mortgage is due in 48 hours, how do you make sure? That's the purpose of it being high liquidity, high marketability. Where I find myself in some conversations is, especially in the past couple of years with how inflation has been, well, I'm losing purchasing power to inflation. But the ultimate goal that we're trying to accomplish is having maximum liquidity. That's what we're accomplishing. And removing the emergency fund from your investable assets when we think about a performance basis is critical, because those are 2 very specific different mindsets that we need to provide education on. Based on your question, Jack, 3 to 6 months is how I think about it in the conversation with with a client or a prospect is how we'll feel out maybe where that number should be and where their comfort lies.
Yeah, and there are probably general rules probably don't work that well here, but the CFP exam actually had some good stuff on this, like in terms of the 3 or 6 month, like one income instead of 2, 6 months.
Right.
Highly job at startup company, 6 months. There's some common sense stuff you can think about, like how solid is my income, how risky is my income, and sort of think about where you should be on that range probably.
I always tell people you're prepaying runway. That's all you're doing. You're prepaying runway. So don't worry about loss of purchasing power. Don't worry about the other stuff. Prepay your 6-month runway to figure out what's next. There's a reason that, Gucci doesn't sell bulletproof vests, because you don't need that to look sexy. You need it to stop a bullet. So set some money aside so that when you get shot, you have 6 months to recover and figure out what to do about it.
One of your best from the podcast, by the way, Matt. Gucci and bulletproof vests. You've done some good stuff, but that's definitely at the top of the list.
That's what I'm aiming to do here.
Sort of shifting from the planning a little bit more over to the investment side. I've been on this compounding kick lately, and I think I've written a couple of posts on sort of the power of compounding. And, I think for younger investors that are starting, and to your point, Ben, it's, sometimes you see these numbers, or you hear these examples, and, you really got to make it relevant to their specific situation. It's hard for people to look at these examples and think about these things and see their portfolio, 40 years in the future being worth X if they save X amount per year. But it is, compounding is very powerful. And I think one of the things the reasons I've been thinking about it lately is because when the market's up, like it is this year, and, portfolio values are up, you kind of see the power of compounding and being invested in the markets and the power of stocks. And stocks don't always go up. For example, last year, they were down, and a lot of stocks were down a lot, but we've come off that low, and portfolio values are recovering, and the way that we invest money for our investors and ourselves, we're sort of seeing the benefits of that. But the article that I wrote, so a couple things. My hair, I apologize because I'm kind of in need of a haircut. So
I've been waiting for you to apologize. I just want to say thank you for the audience.
It was really the elephant in the room through the whole podcast.
Yeah, I know. You guys have been like, when's this guy going to get it? It's actually, I can't even get into my hair. I go to a salon, and it's August 4th. So you guys are going to have to deal with me with this hair growing out for a little
hair
bit.
Inflation is the problem facing the nation.
But here's
hair
the
compounding
thing.
Potentially.
Well, so compounding can work both ways. It can work in helping your investments grow, but I kind of did this little exercise this morning. I said, assuming I get 6 haircuts a year, which is once every 8 weeks. And I kind of do go to a salon. So it costs me, with tip, it's probably $40. It's a little bit expensive, but it's not a barber. But I said, okay, if I'm spending roughly $350 a year on a haircut, what if I took that money and instead each year for the next 65 years invested that and got a 5% return, which is basically what treasuries are getting you right now? The total opportunity cost of not getting a haircut is basically $300,000 if I'm doing my math right. And I'll double check my math, but that's how much my haircuts are costing me based on future value of dollars.
I am so envious I don't get to make the joke that Jack and Ben get to make right now.
Yeah, well, right.
And by the way, this is done by me. This is, as you can probably tell, my cost of haircuts is zero, as it turns out.
Me too.
I guess I need to invest the money.
I want my $300,000. That's what I knew Justin was going to say that. And I was like, this right here. My wife's going to love this part.
You just paid for college.
You're right. College is free, babe.
Yeah. It's crazy. And, using Buffett as an example is a little bit ridiculous, just given his investment performance and his wealth. But it does really, the guy's well into his 90s, right? And it's just, but the vast majority of his wealth, two quick examples, and you guys can comment on this if you want, but 99% of Buffett's net worth was accumulated after he was 50. So he's worth $111 billion in, Berkshire stock almost entirely. He has some other stuff, but, most of it's in Berkshire. And 99% of that, so $110 billion came after he turned 50. So he had massive wealth accumulation, as he had the power of compounding over time. And the other thing, as I was kind of writing this article, I was kind of going around, because I like to use Buffett's annual letters in some of my stuff. And then I went to the press release page on Berkshire. And in 2006, when he committed to donating the majority of his wealth to charity, his net worth was $43 billion. That was in 2006. Just this year, he was able to, as part of this commitment for charitable contributions, he has like a schedule in which he contributes Berkshire stock to these foundations that he's giving the money to. He was able to donate $50 billion in Berkshire stock. So basically, this year's contribution was more than Buffett's entire net worth in 2006. So again, these are just examples of the long-term power and nature of compounding that I think are very important. And the earlier that investors, I know Matt and Ben, you guys certainly encourage this with your younger investors. If people can do it, you have to, obviously, student loans, you're building a family, you're buying a house, you're trying to furnish a house. There's all these other expenses, like to your point, Ben, about insurance and things that people need to be thinking about. But, if you can start early in investing, even with a little bit, it's super, super powerful as you get later on in life. So that's kind of the compounding lessons that I like to share.
Next to Warren Buffett, I just like to throw this in. The other Buffett, Jimmy Buffett, his stats for compounding they're just stupid. They're literally stupid. And it's such a reminder of, even as fanciful and whatever else you want to describe the life of a musician. I mean, we're talking, it's 50 years of music, 29 albums, 40 world tours. He's a bestseller in fiction and nonfiction. He's got the clothing line, the restaurants. And despite all that, and this is the compounding piece, there's 8 songs. He actually calls them the big 8 that he basically plays every time he plays a show. And it's the idea that you have some simple way to do it. Buffett, staying invested, making the investment decisions he made, all of us, whether it's going to work and getting your paycheck or whatever else. But what's the compounding activity? What's your Jimmy Buffett, like, play these 8 hits? Just do 8 things well and do them for 50 years. And you can amass a small empire if you just stick to your knitting. That's compounding. That's great. I love that. I love that example. So, we've kind of talked about a lot here. I think the focus, the main thing we want to discuss is how, young investors, young people can think about planning, the obstacles that they overcome, maybe some ways to think about it that Ben shared with us, some things that you might not be thinking about that you should be. And then, also understanding sort of the long-term importance and nature of compounding and how that can really, and it goes to your point, Matt, it goes beyond just like someone's portfolio. It's, life is a bunch of decisions, which you and I talked about last week on the podcast. And, those all compound on each other. The relationships we have, the things that we value, the people in our lives, those are also examples of, compounding in life with different things. So with that, guys, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Hi guys, this is Justin again. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode. You can follow Jack on Twitter at @PracticalQuant. You can follow me on Twitter at @JJCarbino, and follow Matt on Twitter at @CultishCreative. If you found this discussion interesting and valuable, please subscribe in either iTunes or on YouTube, or leave a review or a comment. Also, if you have any ideas for topics you'd like us to cover in the future, please email us at excessreturnspod@gmail.com. We would like this to be a listener-driven podcast and would appreciate any suggestions. Thank you.